New stuff. This is very brief. Viruses, again, are not, we mentioned this in 1406, they're not even cells. So if we tried to compare them to the three domains of living organisms that we talked about last time, they don't fit within archaea, bacteria, or eukarya. They don't have all the components that a cell has. Even these prokaryotic cells, they have a plasma membrane, they have cytoplasm, they have ribosomes, they can build their own proteins, they can take in nutrients, break that down as a fuel source. They have waste products that they give off. Viruses don't do any of that. Viruses, we mentioned, are fragments of DNA or RNA, and they may or may not have a protein coat. Most viruses are very tiny. It is true that some viruses have been found recently that have a bunch of genetic material, and that makes the viruses rather large compared to some of the smallest bacteria. But even those large viruses don't have things that actual cells have. Here's all that a virus is. We said it's a little piece of DNA or RNA, and it may or may not have a protein coat. These are examples of various protein coats that you'll see around a virus. They can form these different shapes. Sometimes they put spike proteins around a cell that they have invaded, which is what the coronaviruses do. We often see these little spider-looking structures that's called a bacteriophage. They target bacteria cells, and this kind of acts like a hypodermic needle that injects the DNA or RNA material. There goes those posters. So that's kind of what a virus is. It's just a protein coat and a little piece of genetic material, either DNA or RNA. What it is not, what it can't do, we said it can't on its own make copies of itself. So it can't go through asexual reproduction or any kind of sexual reproduction. It doesn't have any ribosomes. It doesn't have cytoplasm. It can't build its own proteins. It can't synthesize its own nutrients, produce any of waste. It requires a host cell to make copies of itself. And we'll see when it gets inside of a host cell, again, bacteriophages are probably the more common example here, that inject their genetic material into prokaryotic cells. And whenever that genetic material gets into a host cell, it's not concerned, like I said, with making food or getting nutrients in any way. It's only concerned with making more copies of the viral pieces. There are, again, some viruses, they have their genetic part and their protein part. In 1406, we had mentioned, and you don't see it on this slide, but we had mentioned plus and minus strands of DNA or RNA. Again, DNA is double-stranded, RNAs are single-stranded. If the virus has a protein coat, those protein pieces are going to need to be manufactured inside these host cells. And I'd mentioned last time that some viruses that are RNA-based viruses can kind of cut out one of these steps because they can more easily be built directly into proteins without having to go from DNA to RNA, then to a protein. It can just go straight from RNA to a protein. So some viruses are more virulent. They are more successful at getting into cells and more quickly making copies of themselves. That was kind of more 1406 stuff. But when viruses get into a cell, there's two things that they really have to do. They have to dock and find their way into a cell. That's one. There has to be compatibility proteins for them to attach and then get into the cell. But once they get into the cell, the second part is making more copies of itself. So there's the genetic material that has to be copied, the protein pieces that have to be copied, those have to be reassembled, and then the virus is free to go invade other cells. But it makes it very difficult to treat viruses because they're using all of the host cell's machinery. Any medication that would typically be detrimental for that virus is also going to take out those host cells. That's problematic. The other thing we mentioned, we may remember from last semester, that prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, they have proteins inside their cytoplasm that are the proofreading proteins. And they try and check if there's been some type of spelling error in the DNA, they correct that. So there's proofreading software kind of built into the DNA of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. RNA, let me try that again. Viruses, since they are just pieces of DNA or RNA, they don't have all of that metabolic machinery. They don't have any of these proofreading proteins. So mutation rates are much higher in viruses than they are in cells that have those proofreading proteins. It's one of the reasons we see such a fast moving target with these viruses and all of these variants that are coming out. There's just more copying errors that occur. Just a couple of other things to add, and that is that there can be smaller things than a virus that can be detrimental to living organisms. So just to take a step back, we said viruses were genetic material and a protein coat. Here we just have the genetic material, no protein coat at all. This structure is called a viroid, and it's a single strand of RNA. We know that RNA is just a strand of nucleotides. Some of those nucleotides are complementary and they will form hydrogen bonds between one another, which is what we're seeing form these little loops here. So this is a single strand of RNA that's been closed in on itself and has formed this closed loop. These little short pieces of RNA can be very detrimental to plants. They cause a lot of plant diseases. We refer to these little pieces of RNA as viroids. They don't seem to affect animals as much, mostly plants. So just a piece of genetic material, no protein coat. Here in the next slide, we see just the proteins that are the problem. There's no genetic material in this. These substances that we call prions are just misfolded proteins, and they can cause lots of damage to cells. These particular misshapen proteins are the ones responsible for mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. These misshapen proteins basically are going to do damage to the neurons. They punch holes in the nervous tissue and make it very difficult for these nervous signals to be sent properly. If you've never seen videos of cows with mad cow disease, don't watch them. They're terrible. But it wasn't immediately understood what was going on with those cows, and turns out it was these misshapen proteins, these prions. Okay, so that was it. I just wanted to introduce viruses, the fact that they're not a cell. They can't replicate on their own schedule. They don't have ribosomes or cytoplasm. They require a host cell to make copies of themselves. Again, in a microbiology class, you could get into some more of the details about how they dock to a cell and get in. We really just compare them to the other cells we talked about, prokaryotic cells and eventually these eukaryotic cells. Maybe I'll say a couple of other interesting things about a virus, since we're talking about it real quick. Not all viruses are bad. Some viruses are not bad. Maybe I hesitate to say good, but maybe not bad is a better way to think about it. I don't have a picture of this, so let me see if I can find one. You know, sometimes I haven't watched a movie in a long time. Well, what am I trying to think? This is interesting. If I'll just go to this picture. We don't have to see the video of it, but you can see this thing right here. There's a wasp that's coming out of this larvae, and this was one of the times that I remember. I used to read a lot of books that were fiction-based books because I used to think that I had a crazy imagination, and I like to read these fiction books and hear like what other people's imaginations were like. And then I started seeing nature and some crazy things that are in nature that are far crazier than I think anything people can make up. And that's kind of where I probably got hooked onto this stuff. But this happens in nature. There's this plant, this cabbage plant, and it has a relationship with this parasitic wasp. And it calls this parasitic wasp in whenever it's getting eaten by these caterpillars. And what this parasitic wasp does is it lays its eggs in the body of this caterpillar, and the larvae basically eat the insides of this caterpillar. The caterpillar dies, and then you see all of these, we'll see these wasps start to pop out of the body of that dead caterpillar. It's crazy. It's like that Alien movie, but it happens in real life. And obviously this is bad for the caterpillar, and that's the whole point. The cabbage doesn't want to get eaten. So the plant is releasing a chemical signal that the wasp is going to pick up on and be tipped off that there's caterpillars munching down there. I can lay my eggs in those caterpillars. So it's good for the wasp. It's good for the cabbage. It's just not good for this caterpillar. Now here's the question, since we're talking about viruses. When this parasitic wasp injects its larvae into that caterpillar, the caterpillar has an immune system. And that caterpillar's immune system should be able to recognize, wait a minute, those are not our cells. We should attack those foreign cells. But they don't. Their immune system has been compromised. And what has compromised their immune system is that when that little wasp injects its larvae, what is also injected is viral particles. And the virus that it also receives from this wasp is what dampens the response to the immune system. So this caterpillar now can no longer respond to the fact that it's got these little larvae growing in it. So that's why I said I hesitate to say these viruses are good, because it's good from the wasp's perspective. It wouldn't want the immune system of the caterpillar to kill its larvae, but the virus is kind of bad from the perspective of the caterpillar, because it's going to prevent its immune system from responding. So in biology, like I said, it's always difficult to use the terms good or bad, because it's always a matter of perspective. Anyway. What are we talking about? Viruses? Anyway, we will see more about viruses as we get into other examples of organisms. It's nice because we finally get out to the scale at which we live at, so we get to talk about interactions between different species, and viruses will be part of that story.